When beginning the owl, it's good to use your measuring techniques, primarily relational proportion and the sight size, by doing a direct comparison of the other half. Remember, it's like you're trying to do the mirror image. Again, at this stage, I'm not being super precise. I have enough faith in my ability that I can just eyeball it or take those measurements mentally. It's not perfect, but it is a bit more enjoyable to do it that way. And I think at this stage, you might be ready for that as well, if you've done all of the lessons that we've done up until now. You see me squeezing in the background for the model here. I forgot to do that. Student asked, well, do we have to do the backgrounds? And my answer was no, but it is important to realize that things typically don't exist without a background. Even if that background is just white, usually there's varying shades of white behind a person or a thing. So it's important to just remember that. And my professor would always say, you have to take into account the contrast that the background provides. So simultaneous contrast, particularly. A light object is going to look lighter next to a dark object, and a dark object is going to look darker next to a light object. So the backgrounds provide contrast, so that really allows the colors to exist. In this particular image, it's especially true for right above the ear. There's like this light brown, beige, orangish kind of swath of what I could only presume is feathers. And without the background to contrast that, it's difficult to see that, right? And you'll see once the background goes in, the white and the feathers can truly exist. Without that background, it's hard for those things to stand out or exist in the way that they should. You've heard me say this many times, but in the real world, things are not defined by line. When we're drawing something, it's important to, or you could use lines sometimes to, as a placeholder, so you know where to start, where to stop. But it's important to realize that when you're trying to draw three-dimensionally, you cannot use lines to define things. And you've heard me say it before, I'll likely say it again, especially when it comes to feathers. Too often, one of the biggest mistakes that students commit is they try to define the feathers with a dark outline. And that's just not the way it is. It doesn't exist that way. It exists, or it is defined in reality by different shades and values and different colors. So by a shadow or a highlight or a combination of both. And that's truly how things are defined in reality. So when it comes to the feathers or drawing the feathers here, I do make some marks, but you don't see me doing any dark outlines trying to define the feather. If anything, I mean, I challenge you to point out a feather in this whole thing. It's impossible, but what you do see are like swaths of color, swaths of value. And more than anything, when you're drawing something like this, you need to remember that and indicate, using line, you can indicate where those swaths are going to go. And that's really exactly what you see me doing here. I'm trying to separate it. This is going to go there, that's going to go there, etc., etc. Now, it's also important to realize that it's not just swaths, but swaths in a very particular shape and order to try to replicate what you see. And you can, what's the word? You can create the illusion, or you can create the suggestion. That's the word. You can suggest feathers by including a couple of lines, like very thin lines, in a particular order or direction. The beginning here is pretty straightforward. I am using that basic 12 pack. All right, so that involves a lot of color theory and mixing colors. I don't have that beautiful beige color that exists right above the ear there. So I have to try to think of the possibilities or what can get me there. This does involve some experience, but that's exactly what this assignment is for. It's for you to gain experience doing these things. And you can see that I started off with a yellow right there, which then I added brown to, and then I believe I added some white to. Remember, the opacity of a white color pencil is non-existent. It cannot truly cover anything. So for your whitest whites, the feathers right underneath the beak or to the side of the beak, you need to maintain the white of the paper. Now, the white color pencil is an excellent tool to blend, and it does that very well. And I used it in several different places to do just that, to blend. Try to stay directional. You could see that for lack of a better word, that the brown, I don't want to call it feathers because I don't want you to think of it as feathers, but the shades of brown around the eye are going kind of, I don't have the word to describe it, but it's directional. Try to pay attention to that direction. And right underneath the beak, those swaths of brown are also directional, kind of going down and to the left. The word I wanted to say is it radiates, like, I think that's correct. It radiates from the center out, from the brown around the eye, right? And it's easy to see. All you have to do is kind of pay attention. You see me putting, more than anything, and talking about swaths, the background especially is this jumble of colors, right? It's not a thing. It's nothing that you can pinpoint. So that would actually be a good exercise, just to do backgrounds like this to help you identify where different colors would go, right? The challenge with the background here is thinking how to accomplish this. And later on, we'll address that a little bit. Typically, it would be ideal to work from the back forward so then you could adjust your values properly, but I was kind of all over the place with this one. I'm happy to say that my pencils didn't break nearly as much as the butterfly or the model. Eyes are given life by these little highlights. And you'll notice that in the reference image, the highlight is more towards the right. I should have actually done mine towards the right too. I did kind of the mirror image, but I shouldn't have done that. The highlight should have been a little bit more towards the right in the new eye, and that would have made it more realistic. Black is absolutely essential for these things, especially if you're only working with that 12 pack. But I wonder if I could attempt these things without using black at all, and what that might look like. The tiny details are important. So the beak is black at the bottom, gray at the top. But it's not just gray, it's like gray with a tint of blue. And you know that we make gray by mixing black and white. So you see, I grab my dark blue and I add a little tint of that, and I think that that makes it perfect. It's actually in more places than just the beak. I didn't put it everywhere that it needed to go, because by the end of this, I was a bit tired. Right there next to that beak, or that dark brown, can be made by using brown and black. You have to regulate the amount of pressure you use, because you don't want the black to overwhelm your other colors. But this is a kind of an ongoing theme with this one, is the combination of brown and black. So far out of all of these, this one took the longest. This video is double the speed, so it would have taken me roughly 2 hours. So it's important to realize that I know that these videos perhaps aren't super exciting, but I also didn't want to speed it up too much, because then students say they miss things. So I'm only doing double the speed. And I didn't, part of these lessons, or I never did a video for these lessons before, because I do think with everything you've done up until now, you should be able to do this. But I know it can be challenging. But at some point, you have to build the confidence to act on your own. You can't always rely on one of my videos to get you through a lesson. When you do the eye, remember that not just for owls, but for most creatures, the top lid casts a shadow on the eye. And that's pretty important to make it look believable or more realistic. And I go in and I put in that, and I adjust it several times throughout the video. And actually, it's got a little tinge of color too. I believe it's like an orange. I think I used my brown, my brown has a bit of orange, or it has that orange feel. It's like an orange brown. And it worked really well for this one, actually, this lesson. Also, usually when you draw eyes, the highlight will come in one area, and then on the opposite, like on the iris. So the highlight can be usually be seen in the pupil, and in the iris, the opposite area of where the highlight is, that area will tend to be a little bit brighter. It'll tend to glow. Right. I don't think this is the time where I clearly define these feathers underneath the beak, but you can see that what I was talking about earlier holds true, in the sense that these are swaths, in this case small swaths, small spaces of brown and black. That's all it is. It's a funky shape with areas that are black, areas that are brown. When I use color pencil, I do tend to build it up in layers. I'm I've never attempted to just go at it, perhaps because I experiment a lot with color mixtures, especially with the basic pack, which is what I'm using. I don't have the luxury to just, you know, go for it. So I like to build things up slowly. Also, color pencil is not a super forgiving medium, so it's not kind enough to allow mistakes, or it's not forgiving enough to give you the comfort to experiment in that way, to freely experiment. Paint, alternatively, is very forgiving, so you have that luxury or that freedom to just do anything you want, knowing full well, as long as you at least control your texture, that you'll be able to change it and rechange it and shape it and do whatever you wish with it. There are mediums that are forgiving, there are mediums that are not. Ink is not forgiving, right? Paint is very forgiving. And as you experiment with more mediums, you'll start to learn this as well. So it's also another reason I don't kind of just go for it with when it comes to color pencil. I got to be sure it's going to produce a favorable result before I move forward with it. For this part, which is the forehead, make sure that your pencil is very, very sharp because you need a fine point. And then you're going to kind of play with making these lines, leaving a blank space and creating a dark space. And I think that that will give you a pretty good result when it comes to recreating that forehead for this owl. When it comes to that forehead as well, you have to look beyond what's obvious. So obviously there's this area that's like black and white or black, white, and gray. But if you look a little bit deeper into the brown spots just above the eye, beyond the that white spot, which it's not an eyebrow, but let's call it an eyebrow. Beyond that white or above that white eyebrow, quote unquote, you could see these brown areas, but those brown areas have black within them. So that's why you see me kind of extend that black area down to a spot where it might not be super obvious until you look more closely. Also, the black areas that I did have brown in them. And if you look closely at your reference, you can see that as well. So it's important to look beyond the obvious, right? Don't take things for granted. You need to really study these things and try to see what's really going on, and then try to replicate that in your artwork. With that being said, I would say that this is not an easy lesson, especially considering all four of these things. It's definitely, I wouldn't say beginner level. You've come a long way from the follow the line assignment, for example. And rightfully so, you should progress. And I think I really like to see the results when you guys do this, because you typically do a great job, especially if you've been paying attention to all the lessons. Matching value is always important for any bit of artwork that you do, especially this type of artwork. So you'll see me constantly adjusting the value as I work throughout the piece. Admittedly, I'm not blurring my vision. I'm kind of doing it more intuitively. If you're in doubt, remember to blur your vision to compare value. The little details, try to keep that area around the eye white, and you could see the combination of colors I'm using here for these brown feathers around the eye beyond that white area. This is what I was talking about when you see these are like suggestions of a greater number of feathers in there. In those little areas right there next to the beak, you saw all those little black spots. They give you an inkling that there's more going on, and your brain kind of fills in the blank. It's important to notice that for that area, though, the the pencil I was using, I don't know if it was a blue or a black, but it was very sharp, because it's a very minor kind of small detail. Very important detail, but small detail. Even the little details, well, sometimes the little details are the most important. This was pretty challenging for me trying to figure out where that white eyebrow really was meant to go because I think mine's is either longer. Yeah, mine's is longer, so it was challenging, but in the end, I think I figured out something that could work. Look, right there at the end of that white eyebrow on the right side, you see those little black lines encroaching on the white? That's what I'm talking about when I talk about suggesting. And that's what I try to replicate right there. Perhaps my black wasn't sharp enough there, but that's what I mean. And you see that kind of all over the place, and it's important to fit in that type of little detail. Right there on that side beyond the that little brown spot that I did on the left side, it's important to realize that there is a highlight that's going to have to exist there. Now, that's one of the things I was talking to you about earlier as well, which is that highlight cannot exist unless the background is in place. Because right now, behind that brown spot, it's pure white. So you need something you need a dark value there to allow that little highlight to shine. I do believe I added it in later, but that's also true right above the ear. Right above the ear, you can't even see that. It's way too light, but once you darken the background, then it gives it a chance to exist. Trying to give it a slight tint of that brown. The pressure in all of these things is super important. And you need to be conscious of how much pressure you're applying and when a large amount of pressure is appropriate and when a slight amount of pressure is appropriate. You can't just go, full force all the time. That's why we study value scales and things like that. Now I can't, be there to adjust the amount of pressure that you use, but it is important that you at least be conscious that, you do need to adjust, right? You can't just always use all of your strength all the time. And you can't always use no strength all of the time. At this stage, you could really see it start to come together. It's just a matter of working out the details or filling in the blanks. For these spots, I found that with the right pressure, black and brown worked really well. Again, I have a bit of a kind of an orangish brown, so it might be different for you depending on what type of brown you have, and you might have to adjust accordingly, right? What works for me might not work for you. What works for you might not work for me, especially depending on the brand of color pencils that you have or the amount of color pencils that you have. So if you remember, when we try to interpret color, we go to we ask ourselves what the color temperature is. Is it warm or is it cool? If it's warm, then you shuffle between the warmth. So is it yellow, is it red, or is it orange? If it's cool, you ask, is it green, is it violet, or is it blue? So in this case, you look at this brown and you say, well, okay, the brown is warm, but is it red, is it yellow, or is it orange? And clearly it's leaning more towards orange. So even if you have just a brown that's a bit more neutral, you can mix orange with it and you'll likely get a good result. I'm putting these spots in knowing full well that I'm going to go back in with the black and darken them where appropriate. So right underneath the beak, I'm not going to darken all of that because it's not all dark. Some of it is brown, but there's very unique areas or specific areas that are darker. I'm going to try to recreate that, right? So I'm not just going to go in blindly and darken everything. Now I'm starting to do the background. Now, the first thing I wanted to do was I wanted to get it all gray. There's different ways to approach this, but I thought if I could get this all gray, trying to more or less match the value, then I could go in and on top of that gray, I can squeeze in all of these blotches of color that I'm seeing, right? So that's what you see me doing right here. I start with my black, I hatch and I cross hatch, and I believe I go in with the white, but I may go in with the brown. At some point, I do go in with the white, again, trying to get that to be more or less the right value. Recognizing that for the most part, that background is kind of like a warm brown, I go in with my brown, right? And I add a layer of brown. Here we go. So it's about knowing what amount of pressure is appropriate. As I said before, I like to layer it so I don't overdo it. Because if I did overdo it, it would be very difficult to pull it back. Not impossible, because I could go in and erase, but I wanted to avoid that. It's kind of like crossing a threshold, you know? Like you're trying to fill up a cup. But if you overfill a cup, then you're going to have a bigger mess, right? So if you're trying to fill it up, you go little by little until eventually it's full. And that's kind of my philosophy when it comes to colored pencils. Again, perhaps because of lack of experience. But I find that it works for me, right? But I certainly don't have the confidence to just go immediately and try to match a value, because if I overshoot it, then it'll be more difficult for me. You can see how grainy that is. And so the white is necessary to kind of blend it all together and get rid of that graininess. Also, at this stage, it does feel a little bit lighter, but I did know that I would still have to go in and add those individual colors that I could recognize. So I knew that it would change still, even after this. I got a little bit experimental with trying to use blue right there. It wasn't the right choice ultimately, and I did need to use some black. Yet I'm just trying to mirror the blotches of color that I see on the other side. And as I put these colors in, I felt more comfortable with what I was doing as far as this background is concerned. I do see a bit of green there. That's why you see me grabbing the green. I think you should be able to see it as well. Unless if you're colorblind, then you may not be able to see it. And that's okay. Just color it like you see it. And of course, let me know. That way I can explain, you know, whatever is happening. I do see some lighter areas here, so that's why you see me going in with the eraser and kind of brightening certain areas. That's what's happening there. In this spot, I was realizing that the brown wasn't quite matching up, so I experimented with my dark brown and my orange, which it looked a little green. So then I added a little red to that. Remember that the complement of green is red. I tried to get that brown that we see on the other side. I do think it was a better match than the simple like orange brown I was using. But I found once I used it up there, it wasn't really necessary everywhere. But it is good to try to kind of blend these two things together to make it look more uniform, right? If you're doing a mixture trying to get to a brown, then just remember the complements. So dare I say that that ended up being a little bit yellow. I kind of adjusted with black, but if you added violet to it, it would go back to brown. You add um, green to red, it'll go to brown. You add red to green, it'll go to brown. Yellow to purple, brown. Purple to yellow, brown. Blue to orange, brown. And orange to blue, brown, right? So keep that in mind. As you're working on the background, you can start to shape things that are in the foreground. So you see, before that left ear was a little bit misshapen. And just as I'm doing the background, I'm giving it a more well-defined shape. So this is just about done. I'm just working with brown and black to get those little details in. And once those little details are done, I could call this one finished. Perfect? No. Um, but acceptable. Certainly acceptable. I will say for these finishing touches, it's very important to keep your color pencils sharp. It's very difficult to get into those details with a very dull pencil, and it's just harder to control. So please do keep your pencils sharp. All right, you guys, there's only a couple more minutes left for this one. I hope that this is useful to you, and I will see you in class. Bye.